Good morning or good afternoon or good evening. And I'm Eda. And first of all, I wanted to say a big thank you to my colleagues, to Mindy and Sarah and Nathan and Seth, who have been very kind to enable me to join you virtually today. And I appreciate that. And I send my hellos to everyone who is here in person or perhaps virtually, and send my good wishes. So in this talk, I will reflect on how neoliberal capitalism has been damaging spaces for learning in higher education. And I argue that fighting this context is needed to move through pandemic traumas. By neoliberal capitalism, I refer to an emphasis on individualism and markets, a fantasy that competition and self-interest are sufficient for success. This approach justifies attempted destruction of social welfare and relationality and is enacted through legislation, through media reporting, in ideology. The research of Fataki and Prasad in 2015 is an example discussing neoliberal capitalism in education. I consider how senior management in higher education in some instances responded to global pandemic traumas, rather than pause and collectively self-reflect about the purpose and direction of higher education. There has been a determined continuation of damaging neoliberal capitalism. Frontline university staff kept teaching and student support going in universities in the past 2 years through difficult personal and organizational pandemic circumstances. In response, instead of appreciation and material support, some UK university management used the pandemic as a cover for redundancies or what are called layoffs. Some demonstrated intransigence in working on the problems of unsafe workloads, of casualization of staff, which means insecure contracts, inequalities, and slashes to pensions. With psychoanalysis, I will be focusing on transference to analyze how pandemic traumas have in some spaces worsened, rather than work towards alleviating pre-existing neoliberal capitalist violence to higher education learning spaces. So for the purpose of today's PDW, I define transference as unconscious dynamics that take place in a dyad with sources in prior relations, particularly a person's relationships to their first caregiver or caregivers and to other prior authority figures. There's some debate about the application of transference outside of the clinic, yet if we go back to Freud, we understand that he applied this phenomenon to non-clinical contexts. For instance, Robert French's work in 1997 refers to Freud's discussion of transference, and I quote from this work. Freud describes what we transferred onto them, our teachers, and suggests that without taking the phenomenon of transference into account, our behavior to our schoolmasters would be not only incomprehensible, but inexcusable. A quote from Freud, so this is from Freud's writings, and Robert French has quoted this particular quote and discussed this as an example of the application of transference to education from the origins of psychoanalysis. Indian scholarship, notably work by psychoanalyst Sudhir Kakar about the guru-shishya relationship, has contributed to our understanding of transference in educational contexts. The guru-shishya is a historically important dyadic relationship in South Asia, referring to the teacher or guru and the student or shishya or chela in an unequal relationship with shifting dynamics over time. For this learning relationship to thrive, there needs to be respect for the expertise of the teacher, but alongside cultivating the student's inquiring spirit, there needs to be space to fail. There needs to be space to enable transformation. All of this is explained by Neki in 1973, who analyzes transference in relation to the guru-chela learning relationship. Transference is intimately enhanced with countertransference. See, for instance, the work of Howard Stein. Countertransference is vital for analyzing responses of the educator to the student's transferences. As an example, A student's idealizing that is transferred to a teacher could be met with counter-transference responses, such as narcissistic satisfaction, resentment, or ambivalence. The emotional dynamics depend upon each person's unique biographical history in relation to one another. Furthermore, the person in a higher hierarchical position may also be transferring their own unconscious expectations onto the other in the dyad, not only responding with their counter-transferences to the other's transferences. My union's resources, University and College Union, UCU, among other reports, help to illustrate the consumerist intensification of higher education. For instance, through metrics of staff's research and teaching performance, through construction of students as consumers, and the positioning of staff as service providers to satisfy student customer interests. This marketization and metrics-centered approach to education reflects and reinforces neoliberal capitalism. I've worked in English and Scottish universities. In England in 2012, tuition fees were tripled, which continues to have ripple effects upon changing student-teacher relations with implications for the transference. In Scotland, there are currently much lower undergraduate tuition fees, and the Scottish government is helping to fund higher education. However, Scottish universities are embedded in this UK-wide marketizing culture of research and teaching metrics. Furthermore, a strategy of income generation in some Scottish universities is charging very high tuition fees from postgraduate students who are largely international students in the UK. There was a perception among some undergraduate students that a Scottish university was devoted to postgraduate students to the neglect of undergraduate student experience. Yet, the collection of high fees did not translate into care for the education and well-being of postgraduate students. To share a stark example, there was a reported postgraduate student sitting on the floor because of over-recruitment and insufficient chairs to sit in the lecture hall. In this instance, there was literally no space for learning before any emotional space could be cultivated. This exploitation of postgraduate students in the UK from largely quote-unquote non-Western countries, for me, materializes as continued colonialism, extracting resources, fees, in some instances made possible through family sacrifices, fees which are given to business ends rather than for investment in students' learning. High fees and performative talk about interest in the student experience, quote unquote, cannot conceal the lived realities of both teachers and students in learning encounters shaped by neoliberal and market logics. Now, I return to transference and its dynamics and learning spaces. These dynamics of transference may appear in face-to-face teaching. They may appear in online, synchronous, and asynchronous teaching. They may appear in email exchanges. Vital for working with transference to support learning is the need for love in the learning relationship. A quote from Antonakopoulou and Gabriel in 2001 depicts the centrality of love. And I quote from this source: "Learning, as the Greeks realized, is ultimately a labor of love for one's teacher, for one's community, for oneself, and for truth. Yet, love itself must be cultivated and developed through learning." And I end the quote there. I've been reflecting on the challenges of working through pandemic-induced problems in the classroom, the challenges of learning together. How do we do this in a consumer educational context where pandemic-induced emergency changes to education, to the home lives of students and staff, have in some instances been acknowledged, have in some instances been actually used to justify further neoliberal strategies. In neoliberal settings, relationality and love are dismissed. Education is about paying for degrees. Education is focused on the employability agenda, not about the anxieties and struggles of learning and unlearning, which can be processed through the relations of transference. When students are customers, educators become inseparable from a provider of a financial transaction. As an example, a teacher who reached out in empathy and openness to share struggles that teachers may experience was met with the following student response: "We're paying you to do this." And in this interaction, where is the space for working together as fellow human beings, challenged by global upheaval, trying to learn together. Within these oppressive inroads into education, exacerbated by the pandemic, spaces for resistance do continue. Through union resistance, through friendships, through commitment to finding a better way through the pandemic, commitment to finding a better way out of pre-existing neoliberal conditions. And resistance is supported through love, and there will always be love. And failure to connect to a student, such as in the previous example, means trying again. In learning, there is failure of both educators and students. This failure can be painful, and processing the hurt through the healthy potential of transference can lead to transformation, can possibly lead to new understanding. To be committed to learning is to be understanding of the deep social, political, cultural conditioning that tries to distort education. The liberatory resources provided by psychoanalysis, here my emphasis on transference, can help to challenge this damaging conditioning. For however much market logics try to pervert the opportunities of education, we are still human beings. The pandemic painfully demonstrated our inevitable relationality, our need for social welfare, for connectedness, our need to be with one another to truly effectively work on global problems. To learn is also to unlearn, which is to be vulnerable. And the anxieties and joys and pains of learning can be processed through healthy transferential relationships. Transference is also an ambivalent relationship, and ambivalence itself provides vital learning beyond course content about the inevitable nuances, contradictions, complexities of moving through life. And in a post quote unquote pandemic period, it seems vital to uphold the importance of attending to psychoanalytic processes in learning, to help contend with life's uncertainties, pains, triumphs.